The storm raged on, its thunderous growls shaking the windows of the old mansion, while lightning cracked the sky into jagged lines of white. Inside, a fire flickered weakly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room. It was in this eerie silence that the painting hung on the wall, its dark colors swirling like a living nightmare. The portrait was a beautiful work of art, but its beauty was its curse. No one who had ever owned it had lived peacefully, and no one dared to touch it. The legend was simple: the cursed painting would bring disaster to anyone who owned it, but what the townspeople didn't know was that the artist who had created it was desperate to reclaim it, no matter the cost. Daniel was a man burdened by his past, a past that he could never outrun. He had been a bright, ambitious young artist once, full of dreams and desires for fame and fortune. But somewhere along the way, his art had turned darker, driven by his need for recognition and the deep, restless anger that simmered beneath the surface of his otherwise calm demeanor. He had created the painting at the height of his frustration, not realizing the evil he had unleashed. Now, years later, Daniel found himself standing in front of that same painting, the one that had caused so much pain and suffering. He was no longer the naive, hopeful artist he had once been. He was a man burdened with regret, guilt, and the horrifying knowledge that the very thing he had created had led to the misery of so many innocent lives. The story begins one stormy night, on the edge of a small town nestled between dark woods and the wide, treacherous sea. The town had long been haunted by the rumors of the cursed painting, its name whispered in fear. It was an object that drew both fascination and dread, much like the man who had painted it. No one had dared to speak to him directly about it, but everyone knew his name, Daniel Hughes, the artist who had vanished without a trace after selling the painting years ago. Daniel's motivations had changed since then. Where once he had craved fame, now he sought only redemption. The painting had passed from owner to owner, each time leaving behind a trail of disaster, and Daniel could no longer ignore the consequences of his actions. Every misfortune, every tragedy tied to that piece of art, was the result of his desire for recognition. He had first learned about the curse from an old friend who had inherited the painting from a wealthy collector. The collector had passed away under mysterious circumstances, and his widow had claimed that the painting had cursed their lives. As the years had passed, Daniel had heard about accidents, broken marriages, financial ruin, each one linked to the painting. The guilt had eaten him alive. Now, he could no longer stay away. He had to get it back, destroy it, and end the curse once and for all. It was a rainy evening when Daniel arrived at the mansion where the painting was said to be held. The mansion stood like a forgotten relic of a bygone era, its stone walls weathered by the years, but still imposing. The mansion belonged to Mrs. Blackwood, an elderly woman who had long been known as an eccentric. She was rumored to be one of the few people who had managed to keep the cursed painting for years without falling victim to its wrath. But rumors were just rumors, and Daniel's research had uncovered a terrifying truth: Mrs. Blackwood had already lost her family to the curse. As he approached the heavy oak door, Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. Was he making a mistake? Could the painting truly be destroyed, or would his actions only make matters worse? There was no going back now. With a deep breath, Daniel knocked 3 times. The door creaked open, and there stood Mrs. Blackwood, her pale face framed by wisps of gray hair. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, studied him for a moment before she spoke. "What do you want?" Her voice was low, almost a whisper, as if she feared someone might overhear. "I need to see it," Daniel said urgently, his voice trembling with emotion. "The painting. I have to take it back." Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a thin line. "You want to take it? After all this time, you want to take it from me?" "I'm sorry," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I never meant for any of this to happen. It's my fault, that painting. It's cursed, and I need to destroy it. Please, you have to understand." For a long moment, Mrs. Blackwood said nothing. She studied him as though weighing his every word. Finally, with a sigh, she stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. Inside, the house was dimly lit, filled with the scent of old wood and incense. They walked down a narrow hallway that led to a small, musty room. The air was thick with the scent of dust, and the temperature seemed to drop as they approached the painting. It was hanging on the far wall, its deep colors drawing Daniel in, as though it were calling to him. "That's it," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "The cursed thing. I've tried to get rid of it, but it always comes back." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. There it was, the painting he had created all those years ago, now a twisted reflection of the nightmares it had caused. The figure in the painting seemed to watch him, its eyes full of anger and sorrow. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered again, his voice barely audible. I never knew what it would do to people." Mrs. Blackwood shook her head, her expression hardening. "It's too late for apologies. The curse is already here. But if you truly want to destroy it, you'll have to do it yourself. I don't think anyone else could." With trembling hands, Daniel stepped forward, reaching out toward the painting. He had to destroy it. He had to undo the suffering he had caused. But as his fingers touched the frame, he felt a shock, as if the painting itself was alive, resisting him. The storm outside raged louder, as if the heavens themselves were angry at what he was about to do. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a brief moment, he wondered if it was already too late, if he could ever truly make things right. But he had no choice. He had to try. The air grew colder as Daniel's fingers brushed the frame of the cursed painting. His heart pounded in his chest, and a sinking feeling twisted in his stomach. There was something wrong, something more than just the curse that had lingered over the painting. The sensation wasn't just one of fear, but of regret, of a burden far heavier than he had ever imagined. The moment his skin made contact with the frame, the room seemed to darken. The faint, flickering light from the hearth seemed to waver, and the temperature plummeted. The storm outside intensified, and the wind howled as though it too were trying to warn him. "Something's wrong," Daniel whispered, pulling his hand away from the painting. He felt an unfamiliar chill crawl up his spine, a coldness so intense that it felt like it was seeping into his bones. Mrs. Blackwood, who had been silent up until now, stepped closer to him, her eyes wide. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice strained with sudden panic. "What did you touch?" The painting, once so still and passive, seemed to ripple. The figure within the canvas, its eyes so dark and haunting, began to shift, its shadowy outline flickering as if alive. Daniel stumbled back, almost tripping over his own feet as he stared in disbelief. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice cracking with a mix of awe and fear. It moved. The figure." Mrs. Blackwood stepped back, shaking her head in disbelief. No, this can't be happening." Her hands trembled as she gripped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "The curse, it's never been triggered like this before." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the hallway, followed by a distant scream. Daniel's heart stopped, his mind racing. What was that? He rushed toward the door, pushing it open with a force that made the wood groan. The hallway was dim, but Daniel could see the shadow of a figure at the end, struggling against the darkness. A woman's voice cried out again, sharp and terrified. "No!" Mrs. Blackwood's voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes wide with dread. "Stay away from that. Don't." But Daniel was already running down the hallway, his legs moving faster than his thoughts. As he neared the source of the sound, he froze. Standing before him was a young woman, disheveled and wide-eyed with panic. She looked familiar, though Daniel couldn't quite place her face. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, his voice hoarse with fear. "What's happening here?" The woman gasped for breath, clutching her chest. I saw it," she whispered, her eyes darting around the hallway as if she were looking for something to hide from. "The painting, it called to me. I had to come here." Daniel's mind spun in confusion. "The painting? But, how could you?" Before he could finish, a sharp sound, a crack, like something snapping in the air, cut through the silence, followed by a guttural growl. The house seemed to shudder, the walls trembling with an unnatural force. "No!" Mrs. Blackwood screamed, rushing toward them. You've triggered it. You've awakened it. Daniel's heart sank as he glanced at the woman. There was no time to question how she knew the painting. He needed to act, and quickly. His hand shook as he gripped the woman's arm, pulling her back toward the living room. We need to leave, now. The woman tried to break free from his grasp. No. I can't. It's too late. I have to. But before she could finish, the ground beneath their feet cracked with a sound that reverberated through the entire house. A gust of icy wind blasted through the hallway, throwing them off balance. The woman stumbled, her feet skidding on the old floorboards. Daniel held her tightly, trying to steady her. You're not going anywhere until we figure this out. Mrs. Blackwood had turned pale, her face ashen with fear. The curse, it's never been this strong before. We need to destroy it. We need to stop it before it claims us all. Destroy it? Daniel gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief. How? I tried, No. Mrs. Blackwood interrupted. The curse isn't just on the painting, it's tied to the artist. You created it, and you alone can break the bond. But you have to destroy it completely. If you don't, she paused, her voice trembling. You'll never escape. None of us will. The weight of her words hung in the air, and Daniel's chest tightened. He could feel the walls closing in, the house pressing against him, as if it too were part of the curse. The temperature continued to plummet, frost forming on the windows. There was no time to waste. He had to make a choice, and quickly. Where is the painting? Daniel demanded, his voice steady, though his heart raced. Tell me, Mrs. Blackwood. I need to destroy it. Mrs. Blackwood hesitated, but then she nodded toward the back of the house. It's in the basement. I locked it away there. It's the only place where it won't spread its curse to the rest of the house. Daniel's mind whirled. The basement. The last place he wanted to go. But he had no choice. He couldn't let the curse consume anyone else. He had to end it. He had to end it now. Without another word, he bolted for the stairs, the woman following behind him. Every step seemed to echo through the house, the sound of their feet almost drowned out by the distant whispers of the storm. As they descended into the dark, damp basement, Daniel could feel the oppressive weight of the air around him. And then, he saw it. The painting. It was still hanging there, its dark figure staring back at him with haunting eyes. The room seemed to distort around it, the shadows crawling toward the edges of the frame like they wanted to escape. The energy in the air was electric, oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. This is it, Daniel whispered. This is the moment. I have to destroy it. The woman clutched his arm. Do you really think you can? The curse is too strong. It will fight back. I don't care, Daniel said, his voice resolute. I can't let it destroy any more lives. Not even mine. He reached for the matches in his pocket, his hands trembling as he struck one, the tiny flame casting a flickering light over the painting. As he held the match over the edge of the canvas, the shadows in the room grew darker, stretching toward him. You have no idea what you're dealing with, the woman screamed, but it was too late. Daniel dropped the match. The painting burst into flames. The flames devoured the canvas with an almost sinister hunger. As the fire spread across the painting, Daniel felt a cold, sickening wave of unease ripple through him. It was as though the house itself was alive, angry, and fighting back. The woman who had been following him, her eyes wide with fear, recoiled, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. This isn't over, she whispered, her voice tight with dread. The painting crackled, its dark figure seeming to writhe and shift within the flames. Daniel's stomach twisted as the shadows around him began to twist in unnatural ways. The fire burned brighter, hotter, but it didn't seem to be consuming the painting as it should. It felt like the cursed figure was feeding the fire, growing stronger, fighting against the destruction that Daniel had set in motion. Suddenly, a loud, deafening sound erupted from the painting, a shrill scream that pierced the air, a sound that seemed to come from both within and beyond the house itself. Daniel froze, his pulse racing. His eyes darted around, searching for the source of the noise. But the scream came from everywhere. The walls trembled, the windows rattled violently as if something was trying to break free. The flames didn't stop. Instead, they grew fiercer. The house groaned in protest, its ancient beams creaking under the pressure. Daniel could feel the walls pressing in on him, the darkness thickening around the edges of the room as the shadows swirled in on themselves. The air became suffocating, and he couldn't breathe. Panic began to claw at him, threatening to take over. "It's not working!" Daniel shouted, stumbling back as the smoke began to choke him. The painting's flames spread like a living entity, and it was clear that it wasn't the fire that was being destroyed, but the house itself. "Run," the woman screamed, her voice full of terror. "Run, Daniel. We have to leave before it's too late." But Daniel couldn't move. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the inferno before him, watching helplessly as the cursed image twisted and expanded within the flames. The room began to pulse with an unnatural energy, and suddenly, the figure in the painting seemed to shift. Its eyes locked onto his. "No!" Daniel shouted, his hands trembling. "You won't take me. I won't let you." He turned and ran toward the stairs, but the floor beneath his feet seemed to warp and stretch, sending him tumbling down onto the wooden boards. The basement was no longer a place of refuge, it was a death trap. The shadows twisted and rose, curling into tendrils that reached out for him, dragging him back toward the fire. The house screamed in protest as if protesting the very existence of the curse it had been forced to carry. "Help me," the woman cried out, reaching for him, her face pale with fear. "Please, Daniel. We can't escape it." The smoke thickened, and Daniel's throat burned as he gasped for air. He looked at the woman, her face contorted with fear, yet there was something in her eyes that made him hesitate. She wasn't just scared. She was pleading with him, silently begging for help. And then it hit him, she was trapped too. This curse, this twisted nightmare, had claimed her just as much as it had claimed him. She had warned him earlier, but he hadn't listened. She had known the consequences of triggering the curse, but he had thought he could control it. Now, it seemed that no one, could escape its wrath. "Get up!" Daniel shouted, pulling himself to his feet, grabbing her hand. "We have to get out of here, now." But as soon as he pulled her toward the stairs, the very ground beneath their feet gave way. A deep, rumbling noise echoed through the house, and before either of them could react, the floor split open, revealing an enormous chasm below. The shadows seemed to spill out of the abyss, swirling in a vortex of dark energy that pulled at their bodies, trying to drag them down into the depths. The woman screamed, her hands grasping at the air, but there was no way to escape. The chasm widened with every second, the darkness growing, and the fire seemed to spread even faster. With no choice but to act, Daniel grabbed the woman's arm and yanked her away from the opening. They scrambled toward the narrow hallway, but the walls were closing in on them. The pressure was unbearable, and the air was thick with smoke. "We can't outrun it," the woman shouted, panic rising in her voice. "It's everywhere. We're trapped." "No!" Daniel gritted his teeth. "We can't give up. We have to keep fighting." But as they reached the stairs, something blocked their path. A shadowy figure appeared in the doorway, tall, dark, and menacing. It was the figure from the painting, standing in the hallway like a monstrous version of itself, its eyes glowing with malevolent energy. Daniel's heart stopped. The figure was real. The curse had somehow brought it to life, and now it was standing between them and escape. The woman screamed again, but Daniel didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his fists clenched in defiance. "Get away from us," he shouted. "You can't have us." The figure tilted its head, its eyes narrowing as if studying him. Then, with an unnatural shriek, it lunged forward, its form shifting and twisting as it grew. Dark tendrils of energy shot out, grabbing at Daniel's legs, pulling him toward the creature. The woman cried out in terror, trying to drag him away, but her efforts were futile. "I won't let you take me," Daniel roared, struggling against the force pulling him in. The figure's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, but Daniel refused to give in. In a desperate, final attempt to break free, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the matches once again. He held them up high, the small flame flickering, but it was enough. He threw the match at the shadows swirling around him, and in that instant, the creature recoiled. "No," the woman screamed, but it was too late. The fire from the match hit the shadowy tendrils, and they burst into flames. The figure screamed in agony as the fire consumed it, the shadows dissipating in a burst of light. Daniel fell to the ground, gasping for air. The figure was gone. The shadows had vanished, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the house was silent. We did it," the woman whispered, her voice shaky, as she helped Daniel to his feet. But Daniel knew that it wasn't over yet. The curse had not been destroyed. It had only been delayed. The darkness had retreated, but for how long? And what would they face next? The tension is rising, and the stakes are high. Daniel and the woman are now caught in a battle against not only the curse, but the very forces trying to stop them. The suspense continues to build as their journey unfolds. The fire flickered and dimmed in the now empty hallway, the shadows seeming to retreat with the death of the dark figure. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps, his mind still reeling from the violent confrontation. His chest burned, and his legs felt like they might give way beneath him. The woman beside him, equally shaken, stood frozen, her wide eyes fixed on the spot where the figure had vanished. The house was silent. The storm outside had faded into a distant rumble, leaving an eerie stillness that seemed to fill every corner of the crumbling mansion. The air was thick with smoke, and the oppressive weight of the curse still clung to the walls. Did we do it?" The woman's voice trembled as she spoke, her hand still clutching Daniel's arm. She looked at him, but her gaze was distant, as if she were unsure whether the battle was truly over or if it had merely paused. Daniel wiped his forehead, his hand shaking. "I don't know," he murmured, the words heavy with doubt. "But I think it's only just beginning. That thing, it wasn't just the curse. It was part of it, somehow. We haven't defeated it, not yet." His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what had just happened. The figure had been real, alive, almost. A dark reflection of the artist's madness, no doubt, but now it was gone. He felt the sting of unfinished business, a gnawing fear that this momentary victory was fragile. The curse wasn't something that could be defeated by a match and a brief confrontation. No, it had more to it. Something deeper, darker. "Then what do we do?" the woman asked, her voice desperate. She stepped closer to him, her face contorting with anguish. "We can't stay here. It'll come back." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. "We need to find the source, the one who created it. The artist. He must know how to end this." The woman's eyes widened in horror. "The artist? You don't understand, he's dead. The curse, it was his legacy. No one knows how to stop it, not really." She shook her head vehemently. "But there's a way. I know there's a way." The urgency in her voice pushed Daniel forward, shaking him from his daze. "What way?" he demanded, stepping toward her. "Tell me now. We don't have time." She hesitated, glancing at the still smoking ruins of the basement. "There's a ritual. A way to banish the curse, but it requires one of us to make a sacrifice. A true sacrifice." Daniel's heart sank, the weight of her words pressing on his chest. "What do you mean, a sacrifice?" The woman's face contorted with sorrow. "To truly destroy the painting and its curse, one of us must be willing to merge with it, to become part of the curse. It's the only way to sever the tie it has to this world." Daniel recoiled. "You can't be serious. You want me to?" No, not you, she interrupted, her voice pleading now. It has to be me. I've been connected to it for so long, since I first saw it. I've felt its power pulling at me, twisting my mind. I've always known that one day, I'd have to end it, even if it meant ending myself. Daniel's mind spun as he took a step back. He couldn't let her do this. The woman, who had been trapped just as much as he was now asking to give up her life to stop the curse. No, I won't let you, Daniel insisted, his voice sharp with refusal. There has to be another way. There must be. She looked at him, her expression softening. I've spent my entire life running from this. From this painting. From the curse. But now it's my time to stop it. Don't you see? The only way to destroy it is to become a part of it, become the sacrifice. I can't live with it anymore. Her words echoed through his mind, each one sinking into his heart like a dagger. He felt torn, trapped between the desperate need to save her and the cold reality that she was right. The curse had its grip on them both, and unless they severed the tie completely, it would never let them go. No! Daniel shouted, taking a step forward. There has to be another way. I won't let you. Before he could finish, the house suddenly shuddered, and a deafening sound filled the air. The floor beneath their feet cracked open, and the walls groaned in agony. The shadows in the corners of the room began to writhe again, slithering like snakes toward them. The temperature plummeted, and a deep, guttural voice, almost as if from the depths of the earth, began to growl. You cannot escape, the voice roared. You cannot destroy what was never meant to be destroyed. The woman gasped and stumbled back, her face pale with fear. The painting's curse was alive again, stronger than ever. Daniel, it's too late, she screamed. We have to do it. Now. It's the only way. The shadows closed in on them, the very walls seeming to pulse with dark energy. They were running out of time, and Daniel could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His pulse raced, his thoughts a chaotic blur. He couldn't let her sacrifice herself. He couldn't. But then he realized something. The woman had lived with this curse for so long. She was the one who knew its power, its hold on her. The only way to truly end it, to sever the ties to the cursed painting, was to let her go. She turned to him, her eyes filled with an unbearable sadness. Daniel. I'm sorry. But this is the only way. Before he could respond, she stepped forward, placing her hand on the painting's charred frame. The moment her skin touched it, the shadows shrieked, twisting and spiraling around her. She gasped, her body trembling with the force of the curse pulling her in. Daniel reached out, but it was too late. With one last, defiant scream, the woman was swallowed by the shadows, her form merging with the painting as it burned brighter than ever. The flames flared, but this time, it wasn't just the canvas burning. The entire room seemed to catch fire, the curse consuming everything in its path. Daniel fell to his knees, his heart shattering as he watched her disappear into the fire. The room exploded in a burst of light. For a moment, everything was still. The flames died down, and the shadows vanished. The oppressive weight of the curse lifted, leaving the house silent and still. Daniel slowly rose to his feet, the air now clear and cool, as though the storm had passed. His chest ached, and he couldn't breathe as he looked at the spot where the woman had stood. It was over. She had sacrificed herself. The curse was gone. And Daniel was free. But he knew that the cost of freedom was a price far too high to ever forget. The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel stood alone in the middle of the room, his knees weak, his heart aching with the weight of what had just happened. The house, once filled with ominous shadows and oppressive energy, was now eerily quiet. The cursed painting, now nothing more than a burnt relic, was gone. The oppressive darkness had lifted, but in its place, a deep, empty silence spread throughout the house. The fire that had consumed the woman, and the curse, had finally burned itself out, leaving nothing but ash and smoldering remnants. Daniel's chest was tight, his breath shallow. He couldn't move, couldn't even bring himself to leave. His mind raced with thoughts of the woman who had sacrificed everything to end the curse. He could still see her face, hear her final words. "It's over," he whispered to himself, but it felt hollow. Was it really over? Could he truly find peace after all of this? He looked down at the floor, his eyes scanning the ashes that remained of the cursed painting. The shadows were gone. The house, once alive with dark energy, now felt still. Almost peaceful. But peace came at a heavy price. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to grieve. He had been part of something far darker than he had ever anticipated. The artist's madness, the curse, the shadows, all of it had led to this moment. And now, he was alone. Alone, with nothing but the painful memory of the woman who had sacrificed herself for the greater good. "Thank you," he whispered into the silence, his voice cracking. "I will never forget." The tears welled up in his eyes, but he wiped them away quickly, unwilling to show weakness. There was still work to be done. He couldn't stay here forever. The house, now quiet, no longer felt like a prison, but it still wasn't a place for him to linger. He had to leave. The curse had ended, but the consequences of their actions would stay with him forever. How could he ever go back to the life he once knew after everything that had happened here? As he began to gather his things, preparing to leave the house, something strange occurred. A gust of wind rattled the windows, as if the very air was trying to push him out. Daniel paused, looking toward the door. It was as though the house itself was urging him to leave, to move on. He stood there for a long moment, just listening. The wind howled outside, but within the house, there was only silence. Then, without warning, the front door creaked open, as if beckoning him. He stepped cautiously toward it, his steps slow and deliberate. The house had finally released its grip on him. It was time to leave. Time to step into the unknown. But before he could take another step, a soft sound caught his attention. A faint scraping noise, like someone, or something, was moving in the next room. Daniel froze, his heart racing. Was it possible? Could it be? Had the curse not truly been broken? His mind flashed back to the moment the woman had disappeared into the painting, but no. The curse was gone. It had to be. Cautiously, he crept toward the source of the noise. It was coming from the basement. The same basement where everything had started. The same basement that had almost claimed his life, that had been the heart of the curse. The door to the basement stood ajar, the faintest glimmer of light leaking out from the crack. Daniel swallowed hard, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He had to check. He couldn't just leave. Not yet. He opened the door slowly, his breath caught in his throat. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw something, or rather, someone, standing in the center of the room. It was her. The woman. She stood there, no longer a figure of darkness and despair, but now glowing with a faint light, a serene expression on her face. She was no longer a prisoner of the curse. Her form was ethereal, as though she had transcended the darkness that had once claimed her. "You," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. "But, you, how?" The woman smiled gently, her eyes filled with a warmth that contrasted the shadows she had once carried. "I'm not gone, Daniel," she said softly. "Not completely. The curse, it's broken. But there's a piece of me that will always remain. You're free, but I will always be here. In some way." Daniel's heart swelled with emotion. He wanted to reach out to her, but he was afraid. Afraid that if he did, she would slip away, that this fragile moment would dissolve into nothingness. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How is this possible?" "The curse was never just about the painting," she explained, her voice calm and soothing. "It was about the connection between the artist and the victim. You and I were both part of that. And now, with the curse broken, I can finally rest." but not in the way I thought I would. I won't disappear entirely. I'll always be here. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding. The curse had been about more than just the painting. It had been about their shared suffering, their shared fate. Now, they were both free from it. Free to move on. The woman, though gone in the physical sense, would always be a part of him. She had made her sacrifice, but her legacy would remain with him forever. He stepped forward, a single tear falling down his cheek. I'll never forget you, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. You saved me. Her smile was gentle, and as she faded away, her form slowly dissipating into the air, she left behind a soft, radiant glow that filled the basement with warmth. And then, just like that, she was gone. Daniel stood in the silence once again, the weight of the moment settling over him. The curse had been broken, but the emotional scars would remain. He had lost so much, but in the end, he had gained something invaluable, peace. The house no longer felt suffocating. It no longer felt like a prison. It was just an empty shell, and with each passing moment, it seemed less and less important. The curse had been defeated. The shadows had retreated. And now, Daniel could finally leave. He could finally begin his life again. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, he took a deep breath. The weight of the past would never truly leave him, but he knew that it no longer had the power to define him. He had been given a second chance. The house behind him was quiet now. The storm had passed. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt the faintest flicker of hope. The house, once filled with despair, now stood in quiet solitude, bathed in the pale light of dawn. Daniel stepped out from the threshold, the faint scent of ash lingering in the air behind him. His heart felt lighter now, as though a burden that had plagued him for so long had finally been lifted. The curse was over. The woman, the artist, and the darkness that had held him captive for so long were gone. He had done it. For the first time in months, the weight of fear and uncertainty had lifted. The shadows that had haunted his every step were no more. There was no longer the looming threat of a curse that would tear him apart, piece by piece. And yet, as he stood in the quiet morning light, the finality of it all pressed down on him. The house was behind him, but his journey wasn't finished. There was still so much to understand, so much he still had to process. Daniel took a deep breath and looked around. The landscape was beautiful in the early morning light, the soft glow of the sun casting a golden hue over everything. It seemed almost serene, as if the world itself had washed away the scars of the past. The wild, untamed forest stretched out before him, a reminder of the journey he'd taken, both physically and emotionally. It was a new day, and for the first time, he was free to choose his next step. But where would he go? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Daniel had no clear destination, no set path ahead of him. He had come to this house seeking something, answers, perhaps, or an escape from the chaos that had consumed his life. But what did he have now, after everything? Was he really free, or was he simply wandering in the aftermath of it all? I'm not sure where to go, he murmured aloud, though there was no one there to answer. The soft rustle of leaves stirred the air as Daniel turned to face the direction of the road that led away from the house. He didn't know what was waiting for him there, but he knew he couldn't stay. He needed to find closure. He needed to build a future from the fragments of his past. As he began walking away from the house, the memory of the woman, the one who had helped him, lingered in his mind. He remembered her last words, the warmth in her voice as she spoke of peace and release. I'll always be here, she had said, and though she was no longer there in the physical sense, Daniel felt that her presence would never truly fade. He would carry her with him in some way, as she would carry him. Her sacrifice had given him a second chance. It was a chance he wouldn't squander. Daniel walked for what felt like hours, the path ahead uncertain but his steps more determined with each passing minute. The world around him seemed to open up, as though the very air was inviting him to move forward. But with every step, he was reminded of everything he had left behind, the house, the curse, and the darkness that had once consumed him. He had been changed by this experience, irrevocably so. But was that change for the better? His thoughts were interrupted when he came across a small, quiet village. It was a place of simplicity where life moved slowly, untouched by the storms of the outside world. The village felt like a refuge, a place to breathe and begin again. As he wandered through the cobblestone streets, he saw people going about their daily lives, children playing, families gathered in the square, and old men sitting on benches, watching the world go by. Daniel found himself drawn to a small inn, the wooden sign hanging above the door swaying gently in the breeze. It seemed like a peaceful place. He could find rest here. He could gather his thoughts and begin to heal. As he pushed open the door to the inn, the warmth of the fire inside greeted him. The innkeeper, a kind-looking woman in her 60s, looked up from behind the counter, her face lighting up with a welcoming smile. "Can I help you, young man?" she asked, her voice soft and kind. "I need a room," Daniel replied quietly, his voice hoarse from days of uncertainty. "Just for a night, if that's possible." The innkeeper nodded and handed him a key, her eyes studying him with a knowing gaze. "You look like you've been through a lot," she said gently. "Take some time to rest. You've earned it." Daniel nodded gratefully and took the key, heading upstairs to his room. The small room was simple, but the bed was inviting, and the quietness of the place was a balm for his soul. He sat down on the edge of the bed, closing his eyes for a moment and letting the peace of the place wash over him. The past was behind him now. It was time to move forward. He spent the next few days in the village, walking its peaceful streets, speaking with the locals, and finding a rhythm to his life that had been absent for so long. He didn't feel ready to jump back into the world he had once known, the one filled with ambition, deadlines, and constant pressure. Instead, he spent his days in quiet reflection, thinking about what mattered most to him now. One afternoon, as he sat by the village's small river, watching the water flow calmly by, Daniel had an epiphany. The world would always be unpredictable, filled with dangers and uncertainties, but it was how one responded to those challenges that mattered. The curse had come into his life unexpectedly, as had the woman, the house, and the darkness that had followed him. But in the end, it was his actions that had brought about the change. He had faced his fears. He had fought back. And now, he was free. His eyes brightened with realization. He had learned that no matter what had happened to him, he had the power to shape his future. It wasn't about waiting for things to change, it was about embracing the opportunity to rebuild, to create a new life from the ashes of the past. His journey had taught him resilience, and now it was time to live by it. The villagers, seeing the transformation in him, welcomed him as one of their own. Daniel began helping around the village, using his skills to contribute to the community. He repaired homes, helped with the harvest, and even shared stories of the world beyond the village, stories of adventure, mystery, and courage. And so, Daniel's life began again, not in the shadows of a cursed house, but in the warmth of a new beginning. The lessons he had learned, the value of perseverance, the power of personal change, and the importance of embracing the present, guided him as he moved forward. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. The future was his to shape. In time, he found peace. Not just in the world around him, but within himself. He had faced darkness and come through it, stronger and wiser. And now, he was free to live.